In a quiet kitchen, single mother Emma's world changes when her son Thomas, a lively 7-year-old, claims a new boy. James looks exactly like him. Their uncanny resemblance, right down to the crescent-shaped birthmark, uncovers a buried truth. James, an adopted child, maybe Emma's son, lost in the hospital's lies. A story of pain, discovery, and redemption. From a shocking DNA revelation to a dying confession, Emma's journey to reclaim her twin sons is gripping, blending raw emotion with a relentless pursuit of justice. The kitchen glowed under the soft hum of a single bulb, its light pooling on the worn linoleum floor. The air was thick with the scent of simmering tomato sauce, a faint anchor in the storm of Emma Reed's evening routine. At 32, she wore the weight of single motherhood like a second skin, juggling a receptionist job, overdue bills, and her 7-year-old son, Thomas, with a quiet grit that kept her moving. Her hands, calloused from years of scrubbing dishes and folding laundry, stirred the pot mechanically, her mind drifting to the electric bill she'd tucked away in a drawer. Outside, the late summer dusk painted the world in shades of amber, and the distant laughter of neighborhood kids echoed through the open window. Emma exhaled, brushing a strand of chestnut hair from her face. She was halfway through chopping an onion when the back door slammed open with a force that rattled the hinges. Her heart skipped, the knife pausing mid-slice. Thomas burst in, a whirlwind of muddy sneakers and untamed energy. His pale cheeks were flushed, his sandy blonde curls plastered to his forehead with sweat. His soccer ball, scuffed and dirt-streaked, bounced once before rolling to a stop against the fridge. His blue eyes, bright as a summer sky, sparkled with something Emma hadn't seen in a while. Pure, uncontainable excitement. "Mom!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the quiet like a spark in dry grass. "You won't believe it. There's a new kid who just moved in down the street, and he looks exactly like me." Emma froze, the knife hovering above the cutting board. Her lips curved into a tired smile, the kind she reserved for Thomas's wild stories about dragons in the backyard or spaceships in the clouds. She set the knife down, wiping her hands on her faded blue apron, and turned to face him. "Exactly like you, huh?" she teased, her voice warm but distracted. "What? He's got your messy hair and that goofy grin too?" She reached out, ruffling his curls, expecting him to laugh and launch into another exaggerated tale. But Thomas didn't laugh. He planted his hands on his hips, his small frame radiating a stubborn certainty that made Emma's smile falter. "No, Mom. I mean like me," he insisted, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Same nose, same smile, even the way he kicks the ball. We were playing soccer with the guys and it was like looking at myself, but different. His name's James." The word James hung in the air, sharp and unfamiliar. Emma's hand lingered on Thomas's head, her fingers still tangled in his hair. Something in his voice, the unshakable conviction, the way his eyes held hers without blinking, sent a prickle down her spine. She swallowed, forcing a lightness she didn't feel. "Well, maybe he's just got a face like yours, kiddo. Lots of people look alike." She turned back to the onion, her hands moving again, but the rhythm felt off, like a song played out of tune. Thomas crossed his arms undeterred. "It's not just that, Mom. He's got the same, I don't know, the same everything. Like when I look at him, it's me, but he's black, and he's got this cool way of laughing, but it's my laugh. You gotta see him." Emma's knife slipped, nicking the edge of her thumb. She hissed, pressing her finger to her lips, the sharp sting grounding her for a moment. Thomas's words swirled in her head, each one landing heavier than the last. A boy who looked like him, laughed like him, and moved like him. She shook her head, dismissing the thought as absurd. Kids saw what they wanted to see. Thomas was 7, full of imagination and endless energy. This was just another story, wasn't it? "All right, soccer star," she said, her voice steadier now. "Go wash up. You're tracking mud all over my floor and dinner's almost ready." She pointed toward the hallway, her tone leaving no room for argument. Thomas groaned but obeyed, grabbing his ball and trudging toward the bathroom. His sneakers left faint dirt smudges on the linoleum, a trail of his presence that Emma stared at long after he'd gone. She turned back to the stove, stirring the sauce with a wooden spoon, but her movements were mechanical, her mind elsewhere. The prickle in her chest hadn't faded. It wasn't fear, not exactly. Just a quiet unease, like the first ripple on a still lake. She tried to focus on the familiar, the bubble of the sauce, the faint creak of the house settling, the hum of crickets outside. But Thomas's words kept circling back, each loop tightening the knot in her stomach. Exactly like me, he'd said, like looking at myself. She pictured his face, his sharp jaw, his wide-set eyes, the faint crescent moon birthmark on the bridge of his nose, a mark she'd kissed 1,000 times. Could another boy, a stranger, really share that face? Emma shook her head, scolding herself. She was being ridiculous. Thomas had probably seen a kid with a passing resemblance and let his imagination run wild. Kids did that. She'd meet this James, see he was just another boy, and they'd laugh about it over dinner. Yet as she plated the spaghetti, her hands trembled slightly, betraying the calm she was trying to hold on to. Dinner was a blur of Thomas's chatter. Stories of goals scored, a scraped knee, and, of course, James. "He's good at soccer, Mom," he said between bites, sauce smearing his chin. "He kicked the ball so hard it went over the fence. And he's funny, too. He said he's going to join our team." Emma nodded, her fork hovering over her plate. "Sounds like a nice kid," she managed, but her voice sounded distant, even to herself. She watched Thomas, his face alight with excitement, and felt a pang she couldn't name. He was her world, her anchor, the boy who'd pulled her through the darkest days. The thought of another child, a stranger, mirroring him so closely felt like an intrusion, a crack in the life she'd built. As she tucked Thomas into bed that night, his small hand curled around hers. "You'll like James, Mom," he mumbled, his eyes heavy with sleep. He's like my brother or something." Emma's breath caught. She kissed his forehead, lingering a moment longer than usual. "Get some sleep, kiddo," she whispered, her voice thick. She turned off the light and closed his door, but the unease followed her down the hall. In the quiet of her bedroom, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the framed photo of Thomas on her nightstand. His grin, his birthmark, his spark. They were hers, only hers. Yet Thomas's words echoed, unyielding. "He looks exactly like me." She lay down, the ceiling fan spinning lazily above her. Sleep felt far away, chased off by a question she couldn't shake. Who was this boy down the street? And why did the thought of him feel like a door creaking open to a past she'd buried long ago? The late summer sun hung low, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt of the school parking lot. Emma Reed stood at the gates of Westview Elementary, her arms crossed tightly against her chest as if to hold herself together. The air buzzed with the chatter of children spilling out of classrooms, their backpacks bouncing, their voices a chaotic symphony of freedom. Emma's eyes scanned the crowd, her heart thudding with an unease she couldn't name. Thomas's words from the night before, "He looks exactly like me," had burrowed into her, restless and sharp, like a splinter under skin. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying his voice, his certainty, until dawn crept through her curtains. She shifted her weight, her sneakers scuffing the pavement. Her chestnut hair, pulled into a hasty ponytail, caught the breeze, and she tucked a loose strand behind her ear. At 32, Emma carried the quiet strength of a woman who'd weathered storms alone. But today her hands trembled faintly, betraying the calm she wore like a mask. She told herself she was overreacting. Thomas was 7, prone to wild stories. This James was probably just a boy with a passing resemblance. Nothing more. Yet the knot in her stomach tightened with every passing second. The school doors swung open, and a fresh wave of kids poured out. Emma's gaze darted through the sea of faces, searching for Thomas's sandy blonde curls. There, he was weaving through the crowd, his blue eyes bright, his grin wide as he waved at her. Her shoulders eased, a flicker of relief warming her. But then she saw him. Beside Thomas, matching his stride, was another boy. Emma's breath snagged in her throat, sharp and cold, like she'd swallowed ice. James. He was black, his skin a rich brown that glowed under the fading sunlight, but his face, God, his face was Thomas's. The same sharp jaw, the same wide-set eyes, the same slight tilt to his mouth when he smiled. And there, unmistakable, was the crescent moon birthmark on the bridge of his nose, a mirror of the one Emma had kissed on Thomas 1,000 times. Her keys slipped from her fingers, clattering to the ground with a metallic ring that felt deafening in her ears. She didn't move to pick them up. She couldn't. Her legs felt rooted, her pulse a wild drumbeat in her chest. "Mom, this is James," Thomas called, his voice bright, oblivious to the storm breaking inside her. He bounded toward her, James trailing a step behind, his sneakers scuffing the pavement. James gave a shy nod, his eyes, Thomas's eyes, meeting hers for a fleeting moment before darting to the ground. His hands fidgeted with the strap of his backpack, a small, nervous gesture that pierced Emma's heart. "Hi, James," she managed, her voice thin, unsteady. She forced a smile, but it felt like a crack in glass ready to shatter. "Nice to meet you." The words tasted hollow, drowned out by the roar of questions in her head. How could this be? How could a stranger wear her son's face, his mark, his very essence? She crouched to retrieve her keys, her movements slow, deliberate, as if moving too fast might unravel her completely. Thomas chattered on, his words a blur. "James is so cool, Mom. He scored 2 goals today, and he's going to come to practice with us tomorrow. Right, James?" He nudged his friend, who nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah," James said softly, his voice low but eerily familiar, like an echo of Thomas's. Emma's hand tightened around her keys, the metal biting into her palm. She stood, her eyes locked on James, searching his face for differences, for anything to prove this was a trick of her mind. But there was nothing. The birthmark, the curve of his cheek, the way his eyes crinkled at the edges. It was Thomas, remade in another skin. The walk home was a haze. Thomas skipped ahead, kicking a pebble along the sidewalk, while James matched his pace, their laughter weaving together. Emma trailed behind, her steps heavy, her mind spiraling. She watched them, 2 boys so alike, yet so different, and felt a pull in her chest, a mix of wonder and dread. Thomas's pale hand brushed against James's darker one as they gestured wildly, reenacting a play from their game. They moved like twins, their steps synced, their heads tilting at the same angle. It was beautiful and terrifying. At home, Emma busied herself with dinner, her hands moving on autopilot, boiling water, slicing bread, setting the table. Thomas and James sat on the living room floor, their heads bent over a pile of Thomas's trading cards. Their laughter drifted into the kitchen, a sound that should have warmed her, but instead twisted the knot in her stomach tighter. She gripped the counter, her knuckles whitening. This wasn't right. It couldn't be. Yet every glance at James, every glimpse of that birthmark chipped away at her certainty. "Mom, can James stay for dinner?" Thomas called, poking his head into the kitchen. James hovered behind him, his expression hopeful but guarded. Emma hesitated, her heart racing. She wanted to say no, to send James home, to close the door on this unsettling mystery. But Thomas's pleading eyes and James's quiet hope stopped her. "Sure," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "Just let his parents know." James nodded, pulling a small phone from his backpack to text his adoptive family. Emma watched him, her mind flashing to Thomas's words. "He's like my brother or something." The thought sent a shiver down her spine, sharp and unyielding. She turned back to the stove, stirring the pasta with more force than necessary, as if she could drown her thoughts in the clatter of pots. Dinner was loud, Thomas filling the silence with stories of school and soccer. James chimed in occasionally, his voice growing bolder, his smile more open. Emma watched them, her fork untouched, her food cooling on her plate. She studied James's face, tracing the lines that matched Thomas's so perfectly. The birthmark gleamed under the kitchen light, a silent accusation. She thought of the hospital 7 years ago, the sterile halls, the doctor's grim face, the words that had broken her. Your second child didn't make it. She'd believed them. She'd had to. But now with James sitting at her table, laughing with her son. Doubt crept in like a thief. As James thanked her for dinner and left, his backpack slung over one shoulder, Emma stood at the door, watching him disappear down the street. Thomas tugged at her hand, yawning. "Told you he's cool, Mom," he mumbled, already half asleep. She nodded, her throat tight. "Yeah, kiddo. He's something." She locked the door, the click echoing in the quiet house. Alone in the kitchen, she sank into a chair, her eyes fixed on Thomas's school photo on the fridge. His birthmark, his smile, his spark, they were hers. But tonight, they felt shared, claimed by a boy she didn't know. And in the silence, a single question burned. Who is James, and why does he feel like mine? The morning sun filtered through the kitchen curtains, casting a soft glow on the chipped mugs and half-empty coffee pot. Emma Reed moved through her routine like a ghost, her hands trembling as she poured cereal for Thomas. The image of James's face, Thomas's face down to the crescent moon birthmark, had haunted her sleepless night, each glance at her son twisting the knife of doubt deeper. She'd stood at the school gates yesterday, seen the impossible, and now her world felt like a house of cards, one breath from collapse. The radio droned in the background, a cheerful jingle clashing with the storm in her chest. Thomas bounded in, his sandy blonde curls bouncing, his sneakers untied as always. "Mom, can James come over after school?" he asked, shoveling cereal into his mouth. His blue eyes sparkled, oblivious to the weight his words carried. Emma's spoon clinked against her mug, too loud in the quiet. "Maybe, kiddo," she said, her voice strained. "We'll see." She forced a smile, but it felt like a lie. Thomas didn't notice, already rambling about soccer practice, but Emma's mind was elsewhere, snagged on the boy who'd sat at her table last night, laughing with her son's laugh. She drove Thomas to Westview Elementary, the familiar route blurred by her racing thoughts. As he hopped out, backpack swinging, she called after him, "Be good, okay?" He waved, disappearing into the crowd, and Emma sat there, gripping the steering wheel, her heart pounding. She couldn't go to work. Not yet. Not with James's face burning in her memory, a mirror to the son she'd raised alone. The school's front office was quiet, the hum of a copier the only sound. Emma approached the reception desk, her palms clammy. "I need to speak with Ms. Carter," she said, her voice low, urgent. The receptionist nodded, buzzing the teacher's room, and minutes later Ms. Carter appeared, her kind eyes creasing with concern. "Emma, is everything okay?" Ms. Carter asked, guiding her to a small meeting room. The door clicked shut, muffling the distant chatter of students. Emma swallowed, her throat dry. "It's about James, the new boy in Thomas's class." "Who is he?" Her words came out sharper than intended, edged with a desperation she couldn't hide. Ms. Carter's brow furrowed. "James Walker? He's a sweet kid, just transferred last month. Why do you ask?" She leaned forward, her voice gentle but curious. Emma's hands twisted in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. He looks like Thomas, exactly like him. Same face, same birthmark on his nose. It's not just a coincidence." Her voice cracked, and she hated how vulnerable it sounded. "You said he's in foster care. What's his story?" Ms. Carter's expression softened, a flicker of sympathy crossing her face. "James has had a tough start," she said quietly. "He was found as a newborn, left at a shelter downtown. No records, no parents, just a hospital blanket wrapped around him. He's been in foster care ever since, bouncing around a few homes until a family on Maple Street adopted him recently. They're good people, but James, he's quiet, carries a lot for a 7-year-old. Emma's breath hitched. A hospital blanket. No parents. The words landed like stones, each one sinking her deeper into a memory she'd locked away. 7 years ago, St. Mary's Hospital. The premature birth of her twins. The chaos of the NICU. The doctor's voice. Your second child was stillborn. She'd been too broken to question it, too drowned in grief to demand proof. She'd held Thomas, her surviving son, and let the other slip into a void of loss. But now James, his face, his birthmark, whispered that the void might have been a lie. "Emma?" Miss Carter's voice pulled her back. "Are you all right?" Emma blinked, realizing her cheeks were wet. She wiped her eyes, her hands shaking. I... I need to know more, she said, barely above a whisper. Is there anything else? Anything about where he came from? Ms. Carter hesitated, then shook her head. That's all I know. His file is thin, too many gaps. If you're worried, maybe talk to his adoptive parents. They might have more. Emma nodded, but her mind was already racing past the room, back to that hospital, to the day her world fractured. She thanked Ms. Carter and left, her steps unsteady as she returned to her car. The parking lot was empty now, the school quiet, but her thoughts roared. She drove home, the radio off, the silence heavy with questions she wasn't ready to face. In her living room, Emma knelt before a storage box tucked under the coffee table, its edges worn from years of neglect. She hadn't opened it since Thomas's first birthday, couldn't bear the weight of what it held. Her fingers fumbled with the lid, her breath shallow as she lifted it. Inside were relics of a life half-lived, a tiny knit cap, a hospital wristband, a Polaroid of newborn Thomas, his crescent moon birthmark, faint but unmistakable. She traced the photo, her heart aching. There was no picture of the second twin, no proof he'd ever existed beyond her memory of a fleeting cry before the nurses took him away. She sank onto the couch, the photo clutched to her chest. The hospital had been in chaos that night, alarms, rushed voices, her own body weak from blood loss. They'd told her the second baby didn't make it, that he was too small, too fragile. She'd believed them because the alternative, doubting, demanding answers, had been too much for her shattered heart. But James's face, his laugh, his existence challenged everything. What if they'd been wrong? What if her son had lived, left to a shelter, raised without her? Emma's eyes drifted to a framed photo on the mantel. Thomas at his 6th birthday, blowing out candles, his birthmark catching the light. She imagined James somewhere else. Another cake, another life, and her chest tightened with a grief she hadn't felt in years. She stood pacing the small room, her hands clenching and unclenching. She needed answers, but the thought of digging into the past terrified her. What if she was wrong? What if she was right? The front door creaked open, and Thomas's voice broke the silence. "Mom, I'm home!" He dropped his backpack, his sneakers thudding on the floor. Emma wiped her face, shoving the box back under the table, but her hands still shook as she turned to greet him. "Hey, kiddo," she said, her voice thick. "How was school?" Thomas grinned, launching into a story about a science project, but Emma barely heard him. Her eyes lingered on his birthmark, on the face she'd thought was hers alone. Somewhere out there was James, a boy who carried the same mark, the same spark, and in her heart, a whisper grew louder. "He's mine." She didn't know how or why, but she knew she couldn't let it go. Not now, not ever. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every creak and hum. Emma Reed sat at the kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee untouched before her, the clock ticking past midnight. The dim light of a single bulb cast harsh shadows across her face, etching the lines of exhaustion and resolve that had deepened over the past few days. James's face, Thomas's face, with that crescent moon birthmark, haunted her, a ghost she couldn't banish. The conversation with Miss Carter had cracked open a door to a past she'd buried, and now doubt seeped through, cold and relentless, like water through a dam's first fissure. Emma's hands trembled as she clutched Thomas's baby photo, its edges worn from her touch. The hospital's words from 7 years ago echoed in her mind. Your second child was stillborn. She'd believed them, had no choice but to believe them, her heart too raw to question the doctor's solemn tone or the nurse's averted eyes. But James, with his mirrored features, his eerily familiar laugh, stood as living proof that something had gone wrong. What if her second son hadn't died? What if he'd been taken, lost, left to a shelter while she grieved a lie? She stood, pacing the small kitchen, her bare feet cold against the linoleum. The memory of James at her table, his shy smile mirroring Thomas's, gnawed at her. She'd watched him eat spaghetti, his small hands careful with the fork, and felt a pull in her chest, a mother's instinct, fierce and unyielding, telling her he was hers. But instinct wasn't proof, and doubt clawed at her, whispering that she was chasing a ghost, that hope would only break her again. The next morning, Emma drove Thomas to school, her eyes burning from sleeplessness. He chattered about a new game he and James had invented, but her responses were mechanical, her mind elsewhere. After dropping him off, she sat in the parking lot, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She couldn't go to work, couldn't face the monotony of answering phones while her world tilted. Instead, she drove to a local clinic, her heart pounding with a decision she'd made in the dark hours of the night. The clinic's waiting room smelled of antiseptic, its fluorescent lights too bright. Emma sat, her purse clutched in her lap, and filled out a form for a voluntary DNA test. Her pen shook as she wrote Thomas's name, then paused at the second line. James Walker. The name felt foreign, yet intimate, a paradox that tightened her throat. She approached the receptionist, her voice low but firm. I need a test to compare two children. How soon can it be done? The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, explained the process. Cheek swabs, a week for results, maybe less with a rush order. Emma nodded, her mind racing. She'd need James's adoptive parents' permission, a hurdle that made her stomach churn. What would she say? I think your son is mine because he looks like my boy. It sounded unhinged, but she had no choice. That afternoon, Emma stood outside the modest house on Maple Street, James's new home. The lawn was neatly trimmed, a tricycle parked by the porch. A picture of normalcy that felt worlds away from her turmoil. She knocked, her heart in her throat. A woman answered, mid-30s, with warm brown skin and a cautious smile. Can I help you? She asked. I'm Emma Reed, Thomas's mom, Emma said, her voice steadier than she felt. I need to talk to you about James. The woman, introducing herself as Lisa Walker, invited her in. The living room was cozy, cluttered with toys and family photos. Emma sat on the edge of a couch, her hands clasped tightly. This is going to sound strange, she began, but James looks exactly like my son. Same face, same birthmark on his nose. I think they might be related. I'd like to do a DNA test just to be sure. Lisa's eyes widened, her hand pausing on a glass of water she'd offered. Related? She repeated, her tone wary. James was abandoned as a baby. We don't know anything about his family. I know, Emma said, her voice breaking, but 7 years ago I gave birth to twins. They told me the second one died. I believed them until I saw James. She pulled Thomas's photo from her purse, sliding it across the coffee table. Lisa stared at it, her expression shifting from skepticism to shock. He does look like James, Lisa admitted, her voice soft. She met Emma's eyes, searching. You think? I don't know, Emma said, tears prickling. But I have to find out. Please. Lisa hesitated, then nodded. I'll talk to my husband. If he agrees, we'll do it. For James's sake. Emma left the house, her legs weak, hope and fear warring in her chest. The next day, Lisa called. They'd consented. Emma arranged the swabs at the clinic, her hands steady as she guided Thomas through the process, then watched James, shy but cooperative, do the same. The technician sealed the samples, promising results within 5 days. 5 days of waiting, of living on the edge of a truth that could change everything. Back home, Emma's days blurred into a haze of routine and dread. She cooked, cleaned, drove Thomas to soccer, but her movements were robotic, her mind trapped in a loop of what if. She overfilled the dishwasher, burned a batch of cookies, snapped at Thomas for leaving his shoes in the hall, small cracks in her composure that betrayed the storm inside. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining James's life. Foster homes, strangers' faces, a childhood without her. The thought was a knife, twisting deeper with every hour. Thomas sensed her distance, his questions piling up. Mom, why are you so quiet? He asked one evening, his small hand tugging her sleeve. Are you mad at me? Emma knelt, pulling him close, her heart aching. No, baby, she whispered, kissing his forehead. I'm just thinking a lot. I love you, okay? He nodded, but his eyes lingered, uncertain, and she hated herself for letting her fear touch him. She avoided James, skipping pickup at school, sending Thomas with a neighbor. Seeing him felt too raw, like staring into a mirror that showed a life she'd lost. Yet his absence only sharpened her longing, her need for answers. She cleaned the house obsessively, scrubbing counters until her hands were raw, as if she could scrub away the doubt. But it clung to her, heavy and unyielding, a shadow she couldn't outrun. By the fifth day, Emma was a taut wire, ready to snap. She checked her email compulsively, her pulse spiking with every notification. The clinic had promised results by noon, and as the clock ticked closer, she sat at the kitchen table, her phone in hand, her coffee untouched. The silence of the house pressed against her, thick with anticipation. Whatever the test revealed, she knew one thing: her life and Thomas's would never be the same. And in the quiet, a mother's doubt whispered louder than ever. What if he's mine? The kitchen clock ticked relentlessly, each second a hammer against Emma Reed's fraying nerves. She sat at the table, her untouched coffee now a cold, bitter puddle in its mug. The house was still, the early morning light creeping through the blinds, casting slanted shadows across the linoleum. 5 days had passed since the DNA swabs. 5 days of living on a knife's edge, her heart caught between hope and dread. James's face, Thomas's face, with that crescent moon birthmark, had become a constant presence, haunting her waking hours and sleepless nights. The clinic had promised results by noon, and now at 11:47 a.m., Emma's phone sat before her, a silent sentinel holding the weight of her world. Her hands trembled as she gripped the table's edge, her knuckles white. The past week had hollowed her out. She'd moved through her days like a specter, cooking meals she barely tasted, answering Thomas's questions with half-hearted nods, scrubbing the house until her hands were raw. Every task was a distraction, a flimsy shield against the question that consumed her. Is James my son? The hospital's lie from 7 years ago, your second child was stillborn, had been her truth, her grief, her anchor. But James, with his mirrored features, his quiet laugh, had shattered that anchor, leaving her adrift in a sea of doubt. She glanced at Thomas's school photo on the fridge, his blue eyes bright, his birthmark a faint shadow. She'd traced that mark 1,000 times, kissed it through fevers and bedtime stories. To think another boy, a stranger, carried the same mark, the same spark. It was unthinkable, yet undeniable. She'd seen it in James's shy smile, his careful movements, the way he tilted his head just like Thomas. Her mother's instinct screamed he was hers, but instinct wasn't enough. She needed proof, and the numbers in that email would either mend her heart or break it anew. The phone buzzed, a sharp vibration that jolted her like a gunshot. Emma's breath caught, her hand hovering over the screen. The email notification read, DNA test results, Thomas Reed and James Walker. Her pulse roared in her ears, drowning out the clock, the hum of the fridge, the world itself. She tapped the screen, her finger trembling, and the email loaded with agonizing slowness, each pixel a taunt. Her vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer weight of anticipation. 7 years of grief, of questions buried under survival, converged on this moment. The words appeared, clinical and stark. Probability of monozygotic twins, 99.99989%. Below, in bold, identical twins. Emma's hand flew to her mouth, a sob breaking free before she could stop it. The phone slipped from her fingers, clattering to the table, but she barely noticed. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, the linoleum cold against her palms. Tears streamed down her face, hot and unstoppable, as the truth tore through her like a storm. James was her son, her living, breathing son, stolen by a lie she'd carried for 7 years. He hadn't died in that hospital, hadn't slipped away in the chaos of alarms and sterile halls. He'd been alive, growing, laughing, suffering, alone in foster homes while she raised Thomas, believing she'd lost half her heart. The betrayal was a physical ache, a fist around her lungs. She clutched her chest, gasping through sobs that shook her entire body. The hospital's words, "We did everything we could," rang hollow now, a cruel fiction that had robbed her of her child. She crawled to the couch, curling into herself, the DNA report still glowing on her phone. Her mind raced, images flashing like a broken reel. James at her table, his shy nod, his crescent moon birthmark catching the light. She saw Thomas's face, then James's, their features blending until they were one. Twins. Her twins. The joy of knowing James was alive clashed with the agony of his lost years. Birthdays without her, nights without her lullabies, a childhood marked by strangers' hands. How could she not have known? How could she have believed the lie? Rage surged, hot and sharp, cutting through her grief. The hospital, St. Mary's. The faceless doctor. The nurses' averted eyes. They'd known, or they'd failed, and either way, they'd let her son vanish into a system that didn't love him. She stood, her legs unsteady, and grabbed the phone, rereading the results as if they might change. 99.9989%. The numbers were undeniable, a truth colder than any apology. She thought of James's foster file, the gaps Ms. Carter had mentioned, the hospital blanket left with a newborn at a shelter. It wasn't neglect, it was theft. Emma paced, her tears drying into a fierce resolve. She needed to see James, to hold him, to tell him he was hers. But first she needed answers. Who had lied? Who had taken her son and left her to mourn a ghost? She grabbed her keys, her purse, her mind already at St. Mary's confronting the past. But a glance at the clock stopped her. Thomas would be home soon. She couldn't leave, not yet. She sank back onto the couch, her hands shaking with the effort of holding herself together. When Thomas burst through the door, his backpack swinging, his voice bright, "Mom, I got an A on my spelling test." Emma forced a smile, her heart fracturing under the weight of her secret. "That's great, kiddo," she said, her voice thick. She pulled him into a hug, holding him longer than usual, her cheek pressed against his curls. His birthmark brushed her skin, a reminder of the boy she'd found and the years she'd lost. "Mom, you okay?" Thomas asked, pulling back, his blue eyes searching hers. "Yeah," she lied, ruffling his hair. "Just proud of you." She sent him to do homework, her gaze lingering as he disappeared down the hall. She couldn't tell him yet, not until she had James, not until she could bring them together as brothers, as twins. Alone again, Emma sat, the DNA report open on her phone. She stared at the numbers, her rage hardening into purpose. Tomorrow she'd go to St. Mary's. She'd face the director, demand the truth, and if they wouldn't give it, she'd tear it from them. For James, for Thomas, for the family she'd been denied. She thought of James's quiet smile, his careful hands, and her heart ached with a love she hadn't known she could still feel. As the afternoon faded into dusk, Emma stood at the kitchen window, watching the street where James lived. Somewhere out there, her son was eating dinner, maybe laughing, maybe dreaming. She pressed her hand to the glass, a silent promise. "I'm coming for you, James." The numbers had spoken, and now so would she. The morning air was sharp, biting at Emma Reed's knuckles as she gripped the steering wheel. The drive to St. Mary's Hospital felt like a descent, each mile pulling her closer to a truth she both craved and dreaded. The DNA results, 99.99989% probability of monozygotic twins, burned in her mind, a brand that fueled her rage and steadied her trembling hands. James was her son, stolen by a lie she'd swallowed 7 years ago. The hospital's sterile facade loomed ahead, its glass doors reflecting a woman transformed. Not the broken mother who'd left it in grief, but one forged in fire, ready to reclaim what was hers. Emma parked, her purse heavy with the DNA report, its folded edges worn from her touch. The hospital's lobby smelled of antiseptic and regret, unchanged from the night she'd given birth. Her sneakers squeaked on the polished floor as she marched to the reception desk, her heart a war drum. "I need to see Dr. Harold Grayson," she said, her voice low but unyielding. "Now." The receptionist, a young man with tired eyes, hesitated. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Emma snapped, leaning forward. "But he'll want to see me. Tell him it's about a mistake from 7 years ago. A baby." Her words carried a weight that silenced his protest. He nodded, picking up the phone, and minutes later a nurse escorted her to the administrative wing. Dr. Grayson's office was a relic of authority. Dark wood, framed degrees, a window overlooking the city. The man himself, now in his late 60s, sat behind a cluttered desk, his face lined with age and something heavier. His gray hair thinned at the crown, and his hands, spotted with time, fidgeted with a pen. "Mrs. Reed," he said, his voice smooth but wary, "what brings you here?" Emma didn't sit. She stood, her stance rigid, and pulled the DNA report from her purse, slamming it onto his desk. The sound echoed, sharp as a gunshot. "This," she said, her voice trembling with controlled fury, "this says my second son is alive. His name is James Walker, and he's been in foster care for 7 years because you told me he was dead." Grayson's eyes flickered to the paper, his composure cracking. He adjusted his glasses, his fingers unsteady, and scanned the report. The silence stretched, thick with tension, as his face paled. I don't understand," he stammered, but his voice lacked conviction, his gaze darting to the door. "Don't lie to me," Emma said, stepping closer, her voice rising. "7 years ago, you said my twin was stillborn. I believed you. I grieved him. But he's alive, with my son's face, my son's birthmark. You took him from me. Why?" Grayson leaned back, his chair creaking, his hands raised as if to ward her off. "Mrs. Reed, please. Mistakes like that don't happen here. Our records—" "Your records are a lie," Emma cut in, her voice a blade. She jabbed a finger at the report. "This is proof. James is my son, and you let him grow up without me. Without his brother. You owe me the truth, Grayson. What happened that night?" His eyes, clouded with guilt, avoided hers. He rubbed his temple, his breath uneven. I don't know what you mean," he said, but the words were hollow, a flimsy shield against her fire. "The NICU was chaotic. Premature births, complications. We did everything we could. If there was an error, it wasn't intentional." "An error?" Emma's laugh was bitter, raw. "You call losing my child an error? He was left at a shelter, wrapped in your hospital's blanket. He's been alone his whole life because of you. Tell me what you did, or I'll go to every lawyer, every news outlet, until someone listens." Grayson's hands shook, the pen slipping from his fingers. He glanced at the report again, then at Emma, his facade crumbling. "There was confusion," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "That night there were multiple emergencies. A fire alarm triggered an evacuation. Babies were moved and staff were overwhelmed. We thought all infants were accounted for." "Thought?" Emma's voice broke, tears burning her eyes. "You thought? You told me my son was dead. Did you even check? Did you look for him?" Grayson's silence was an answer, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her words. We followed protocol," he mumbled, but his eyes betrayed him, darting to a drawer then back to the desk. "I don't know how this happened. I'm sorry." "Sorry?" Emma's voice cracked, her hands clenching into fists. "You stole 7 years of my son's life. You let him grow up in foster care, unwanted, while I mourned a lie. Who covered it up? Was it you?" Grayson's face tightened, his lips a thin line. I can't discuss this further," he said, standing, his voice regaining a false calm. "If you have concerns, file a formal complaint. Our legal team—" "I don't want your lawyers," Emma snapped, snatching the report from his desk. "I want my son, and I want the truth. You can't hide this forever." She turned, her heart pounding, and stormed out, the door slamming behind her. The hallway blurred through her tears, her rage a wildfire that threatened to consume her. In her car, Emma clutched the crumpled report, her sobs shaking her frame. Grayson's evasion screamed guilt, his trembling hands a confession he wouldn't voice. She thought of James, his quiet smile, his careful hands, the life he'd endured without her. The hospital had betrayed them both, and Grayson's half-truths only deepened her resolve. She'd get James back, no matter the cost. She drove home, the city a smear of color through her tears. Thomas would be home soon, his laughter a reminder of what she'd fight for. She parked, her hands still shaking, and sat in the silence, the DNA report in her lap. It was her weapon, her proof, but it wasn't enough. She needed more records, witnesses, anything to expose the hospital's sin. As she stepped inside, the house felt smaller, its walls closing in with the weight of her mission. She hid the report in a drawer, her fingers lingering on Thomas's baby photo. His birthmark, his spark. They were James's too. She imagined them together, brothers reunited, and her heart ached with a love so fierce it scared her. The front door creaked, Thomas's voice breaking the quiet. "Mom, I'm home," he called, his backpack thudding to the floor. Emma wiped her face, forcing a smile, but her eyes burned with purpose. Grayson could hide, but not for long. She'd tear down his lies, brick by brick, until James was home. For her sons, she'd fight until her last breath. The phone call came on a gray, rain-soaked afternoon, 2 weeks after Emma's confrontation with Dr. Harold Grayson. Emma Reed stood in her kitchen, the hum of the fridge the only sound as she chopped carrots for dinner, her movements mechanical, her mind still tethered to the DNA report that had rewritten her world. James was her son, her twin to Thomas, stolen by a hospital's lie. Her clash with Grayson had yielded no answers, only his trembling denial and a guilt she could smell like smoke. Now her phone buzzed on the counter, an unknown number flashing. She wiped her hands, her heart lurching as she answered. "Mrs. Reed?" The voice was frail, cracked with age and something heavier. "This is Harold Grayson. I need to see you. Please, it's urgent." A cough rattled through the line, wet and labored. "I'm at my home. I don't have much time." Emma's grip tightened, her pulse spiking. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, her voice cold. "You lied to me." "I know," he rasped, his words punctuated by another cough. "But I'm ready to tell you the truth. Please. I'm dying." The word dying hung like a stone, shifting the air. Emma's anger flared, but beneath it, a hunger for answers gnawed. She scribbled his address, her hands shaking, and hung up without a goodbye. Thomas was at soccer practice, giving her an hour. She grabbed her coat, the DNA report still in her purse, and drove through the drizzle, her wipers slashing the gray. Grayson's house was a modest colonial, its paint peeling, its garden choked with weeds. The air smelled of damp earth as Emma knocked, her heart a drumbeat in her throat. A nurse opened the door, her face weary but kind. "He's in the bedroom," she said, leading Emma through a dim hallway lined with faded photos. The house felt like a tomb, heavy with the weight of endings. Grayson lay in a hospital bed, his frame skeletal, his skin ashen under the glow of a bedside lamp. An oxygen mask hung loosely around his neck, his breasts shallow and ragged. His eyes, once sharp with authority, were clouded with pain and something softer. Regret. "Mrs. Reed," he whispered, his voice a ghost of itself. "Thank you for coming." Emma stood at the foot of the bed, her arms crossed, her jaw tight. "You said you'd tell the truth," she said, her voice low, edged with fire. "So talk. What happened to my son?" Grayson's hand twitched, clutching the blanket. He gestured to the nurse, who nodded and left, closing the door. The silence was suffocating, broken only by his labored breathing. "I've carried this. For 7 years," he began, his words slow, deliberate. "That night in the NICU, it was chaos. Your twins were born early, fragile. Then the fire alarm went off. A faulty system, but it triggered a full evacuation." Emma's hands clenched, her nails biting her palms. She remembered the alarms, the panic, her own body too weak to move. "Go on," she said, her voice trembling. Grayson's eyes drifted to the ceiling, as if seeing that night play out. "We moved the babies, yours, others, to safety. Or so we thought. A nurse, young, overwhelmed, handed one of your twins to a volunteer in the chaos. We thought he'd be logged, returned. But he wasn't." His voice cracked, a tear slipping down his cheek. "When we realized one baby was missing, it was too late. The volunteer was gone, the baby unaccounted for." Emma's breath hitched, her vision blurring. "You lost him?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "And you told me he was dead?" Grayson nodded, his face crumpling. I made the call. We couldn't admit we'd lost a child. The hospital would have been ruined. Lawsuits, investigations. I told the staff to report the second twin as stillborn. We falsified the records, sealed them. I thought, I thought it was the only way. You thought? Emma's voice rose, raw with anguish. She stepped closer, her hands shaking. You let my son be abandoned. He grew up in foster care, alone, because you were too much of a coward to tell the truth. Do you know what you took from us? Grayson's sobs were quiet, his body trembling. I know, he whispered. I saw the news a month later, a baby found at a shelter, wrapped in our blanket. I knew it was him, but I was afraid. My career, my family. I kept silent. I've lived with it every day since. Emma's tears fell, hot and furious. His name is James, she said, her voice ablaze. He's 7 years old with my son's face, my son's birthmark. He's kind, quiet, and he's been alone because of you. How do you sleep knowing that? Grayson's eyes met hers, hollow with guilt. I don't, he said, his voice barely audible. I'm dying, Mrs. Reed. Cancer. Weeks left, maybe less. I can't take this to my grave. I'm sorry. For what I did, for what I didn't do. Forgive me if you can. Forgive you? Emma's laugh was bitter, sharp. You stole my son's life. You stole my family. Your apology means nothing. She turned, her chest heaving, but his voice stopped her. There's a file, he rasped. In my office, locked drawer. Incident report, unsigned. It's not much, but it's proof of the evacuation, the mix-up. Take it, use it. Emma froze, her hand on the doorknob. Proof. A weapon to fight for James, to expose the hospital's sin. She didn't look back, couldn't bear to see his face. I hope you find peace, she said, her voice cold. I never will. She left, the door clicking shut behind her, his coughs fading as she strode down the hall. In her car, Emma sat, rain streaking the windshield, her sobs shaking her frame. Grayson's confession was a wound and a key, unlocking the truth but deepening her pain. James had been handed off, lost in a moment of panic, and Grayson's cowardice had sealed his fate. She thought of James's shy smile, his careful hands, and her heart broke for the years she'd missed. His first steps, his first words, his lonely nights. She drove home, the file's promise burning in her mind. Thomas would be back soon, his laughter a tether to the present. She'd fight for James, use Grayson's confession, the file, the DNA report, whatever it took to bring him home. The rain slowed, a faint sun breaking through, and Emma felt a shift, a mother's resolve hardening like steel. As she pulled into her driveway, her phone buzzed. A text from Lisa Walker, James's adoptive mother. James asked about you today, wants to see Thomas. Okay, if he comes over? Emma's tears fell anew, but this time they carried hope. She typed, yes, please. James was her son, and soon he'd know it. The truth was out, and no one, not Grayson, not the hospital, could take him from her again. The late summer air was heavy with the scent of cut grass, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves outside Emma Reed's small house. Inside, the living room was a battlefield of scattered toys and half-finished puzzles, remnants of a life now poised for transformation. 2 weeks had passed since Dr. Grayson's dying confession. His words, I made the call. We falsified the records, etched into Emma's soul like a scar. The file he'd promised, a faded incident report from that chaotic night, sat on her kitchen counter. Its unsigned pages a silent witness to the hospital's sin. Armed with the DNA results and Grayson's truth, Emma had waged a quiet war, her heart steeled by the image of James, her son, her twin to Thomas, stolen for 7 years. She stood at the sink, washing dishes with a rhythm born of habit, but her hands trembled, betraying the weight of today. This morning, after weeks of hearings, social worker visits, and tear-soaked nights, the call had come. Your petition for full custody of James Walker has been approved. The words had unraveled her, joy and grief colliding as she'd collapsed onto the couch, laughing through sobs. James was coming home. Today. Forever. Emma glanced at the clock. 3:47 p.m. Thomas was sprawled on the living room floor, sketching superheroes, his sandy blonde curls catching the sunlight. He didn't know yet, not fully. She'd told him James was special, a friend who'd stay longer, but the word brother waited, heavy on her tongue. She dried her hands, her heart racing, and checked the front window for the 10th time. A social worker's car was due any minute, bringing James with his small suitcase, his shy smile, his crescent moon birthmark that mirrored Thomas's. The past weeks had been a blur of action and ache. Emma had submitted the DNA report, Grayson's confession, and the incident file to the foster care board, each document a brick in the bridge to James. She'd met with Lisa and David Walker, James's adoptive parents, their faces torn between love for James and understanding of Emma's claim. "He's yours," Lisa had said, tears in her eyes. "But he's been ours too." They'd agreed to step back, to let James return to his birth mother, but Emma had promised visits, a thread of connection for the boy they'd cherished. The compromise had felt like a knife, but it was right. James deserved all the love he could hold. A car pulled into the driveway, its engine a soft hum. Emma's breath caught, her hands flying to her hair, smoothing it nervously. "Thomas," she called, her voice unsteady. "Come here, buddy." He trotted over, his sketchbook dangling, his blue eyes curious. She knelt, pulling him close. "Someone special's here. Let's greet him together, okay?" The front door opened, and there he was, James clutching a small blue suitcase, his dark eyes wide under the brim of a baseball cap. The social worker, a kind-faced woman named Ms. Patel, stood behind him, her hand gentle on his shoulder. James's gaze found Emma, and his lips curved into a hesitant smile, that crescent moon birthmark a beacon in the afternoon light. Emma's knees weakened, her heart swelling with a love so fierce it hurt. "James," she whispered, stepping forward, her voice thick. She knelt, opening her arms, and he hesitated only a moment before running to her, his suitcase thumping to the floor. She pulled him close, his small frame warm against hers, his cap brushing her cheek. "Welcome home," she said, tears streaming down her face. His arms tightened around her, and for the first time, she felt him, her son, her missing piece, return. Thomas bounced forward, grinning. "James, you're staying!" He grabbed James's hand, tugging him toward the living room. "Want to see my drawings? I made a superhero that looks like you." James laughed, a sound so like Thomas's it stole Emma's breath. "Yeah, okay," he said, glancing back at Emma, his eyes bright with something new. Trust, maybe hope. Ms. Patel smiled, handing Emma a folder of paperwork. "He's all yours, Mrs. Reed," she said softly. "We'll check in next week." Emma nodded, her throat too tight for words, and the social worker left, the door clicking shut. The boys sprawled on the floor, their heads bent over Thomas's sketchbook, their laughter weaving a melody through the house. Emma watched from the couch, her hands clasped to still their trembling. She saw their birthmarks, their mirrored grins, and felt a wholeness she hadn't known was possible. But beneath the joy, a shadow lingered. The years lost, the milestones missed, the pain of James's foster care years. She thought of Grayson, his death last week, and his apology was too late to heal the wound. The hospital's lie had cost her 7 years, but it hadn't broken her. It had made her fight. Dinner was chaotic, spaghetti sauce splattering as the boys traded stories. Emma joined their laughter, her heart lighter, but her eyes kept finding James. His careful bites, his quiet delight. After she led them to the backyard, the dusk alive with crickets. They kicked a soccer ball, their shouts echoing, their silhouettes blending in the fading light. Emma sat on the porch, her hand resting on her heart, and let herself dream of their future. Birthdays together, bedtime stories, a family whole. Later, she tucked them into Thomas's room, James in a sleeping bag on the floor, their whispers drifting as she turned off the light. In her bedroom, Emma opened Thomas's baby book, its pages a chronicle of love and loss. She taped in a new photo, taken today. Thomas and James, arms slung around each other, their crescent moon birthmarks catching the flash. Beneath it, she wrote, Day 2, 557. James came home. She closed the book, her tears falling, but they were soft now, not jagged. The hospital's lie, Grayson's cowardice. They'd taken so much, but they hadn't won. She stepped to the window, the street quiet under a blanket of stars. James was here, Thomas was here, and she was their mother. unbroken by the past. As she climbed into bed, the boy's laughter echoed in her memory, a promise of healing. She thought of their birthmarks, their twin hearts, and smiled into the dark. The fight was over, and the truth won. Her sons were home, and no one could take them again. In the silence, Emma whispered, "We're together now." And for the first time in 7 years, she believed it. As the twin mistake draws to a close, Emma's journey from heartbreak to reunion reminds us of the unbreakable bond of family and the power of truth. What did this story stir in you? Did Emma's fight resonate, or did James and Thomas's reunion spark your reflections? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them. Let them linger. Thank you for joining me in this emotional tale, for letting these characters live in your heart. Until we meet again for another story, keep seeking the truths that matter. Farewell for now.